The pancreas is a mixed gland. What does that mean? Okay, yeah, absolutely. It has two different types of tissues. However, so did the pituitary gland. Right, we should probably put up that chart. The pituitary gland does as well. Or it's two different types of tissue, and that's actually more of two different types of tissue. What else could I mean when I say mixed gland? Say it. Yeah, in this case, it is two different types of tissue, but they're both glandular tissue. What's really important about the pancreas and what makes it a mixed gland is it has both exocrine and endocrine functions. So there is a major exocrine component to it. The exocrine part is basically where it makes most of the digestive enzymes. That are being released into the small intestine. Right, which as we know now is outside of the body. So that makes it an exocrine gland. And in fact, when we look at this histology of the pancreas, we see all of these ball-shaped secretory structures. What was the fancy name we had for a ball-shaped secretory structure? Acinar or alveolar, right? So all of the alveoli or acini, those big, huge clumps of darkly stained secretory structures, all of these, the vast majority of what you see here on the screen, are those exocrine acini, producing those digestive enzymes, releasing that pancreatic juice that includes bicarbonate and other things we'll talk about in the digestive system, outside the body into the duodenum and the small intestine. However, as you'll notice, occasionally we have these little islands in the stream. That is what they are. And as you can see, those little clusters are the islets, and they are what are endocrine function. They are known as the pancreatic islets. They are also known as the islets of Langerhans. Of course, because good old Bob Langerhans was the first person who identified it and described them. And they are responsible for producing 4 hormones. Of course, how many of those 4 are you responsible for? Just 2 of them, so that's not too bad. So that pancreas is a mixed gland. It actually produces 4 amino acid based hormones, but we are going to focus on 2 of them. And there are 4 different types of cells found within that islet. Alpha cells, beta cells, delta cells, and gamma cells. We're going to focus on the first 2. The alpha cells, or if we want to write the Greek letter, looks like that. And the beta cells. And of course, beta looks like that. The beta cells are the ones that actually produce the hormone we've been talking about a lot since the beginning of this. It is responsible for producing insulin. We've already done this one, but let's do it again. What is the target of insulin?
Like the adipocytes and the liver cells?
Yeah, liver cells, adipocytes, right? We talked about most of the cells of the body are affected, but adipocytes, liver cells, and what other cell would be highly influenced by insulin? What else needs to store a large amount of glucose inside of it? Muscle cell, absolutely. So I think most of the cells of the body, but especially adipose cells, especially liver cells, especially muscle cells, right? They are influenced by this insulin. As we talked about, interestingly enough, nervous tissue not so much influenced by insulin, even though that is another very metabolically active cell. And as we talked about, basically the effect of that is to tell these cells to pull glucose into the cells and store them, right? Obviously that stores those resources in those cells for use later, but what is the overall effect that they have on the cell? I mean on the body?
Lowers glucose level.
Yeah, lowers the glucose levels in our blood.
So on an exam, if you're saying most cells, especially adipose and liver, adipose, liver, and muscle, would you accept most cells, or do you want us to specifically write adipose? Liver,
I think
muscle?
given the two, I would rather you just said adipose, liver, and muscle than to say most cells. It's always, it's always better to be more specific than less specific. I think it's worthwhile to know something like this, that it does affect most cells, but does it affect all cells equally? No, and so there are some that are going to be affected more than others. So I think that's reasonable either way. All right. So it lowers our blood glucose levels. Right? And of course, how is it regulated? Humorally via glucose levels. There you go. Excellent. Right? We kind of talked about the classic example of this, but we didn't take it to its conclusion. Right? You take that kid to the birthday party. They have those 4 scoops of ice cream, the 3 pieces of cake, the bag of candy in the car on the way home. And so there is a huge spike in the glucose levels of their blood. So there's a huge spike of insulin. However, as we talked about, insulin, like most circulating hormones, are long-lasting. So when you have that huge spike of insulin, what does it do to the glucose levels? Well, clearly it brings it back down to normal levels. But then you still have all that massive amount of insulin in the blood, so what happens then? It continues to go down, and you have that crash as a result of it. Absolutely. So an hour later, the kid's crashing. An hour later, they're hungry again because their blood glucose levels have dropped because of that long-lasting insulin, and so they need more fuel. So again, we've all seen that kind of effect from that. All right. Again, I think it's a pretty obvious one, pretty straightforward. Questions on that?
You said regulated humorally via
Glucose levels. Yeah, glucose in the blood.
Glucose in the blood.
Yeah, anytime we're saying humoral, it's the in the blood is, basically implied.
Okay.
So yeah, humorally, glucose levels, for glucose. However, as important as it is to bring glucose levels down, it's also important to bring glucose levels up. This is something especially true like when you're fasting or things along those lines. And towards that end, we have the alpha cells, and they produce a hormone called glucagon. This is another antagonistic relationship between these two hormones. So if insulin brings glucose levels down, what's glucagon going to do? Bring glucose levels up. How? Yeah, exactly. It primarily targets the liver and triggers that liver to release some of that stored glucose that's been stored in the form of glycogen. It breaks down that glycogen back into glucose and releases it into the blood. Right, as we'll talk about in the digestive system, and we talked about briefly in the cardiovascular system, the liver's major job is to maintain levels of the blood. And so if we see that glucose levels are low, we have the ability to release glucagon from our pancreas and tell the liver to release some of that glucose to help to bring those levels back up. And it should go without saying, but I'll ask it anyway, how is it regulated? Yeah, the exact same way, humorally via glucose levels. All right? Now, as I mentioned, all of these are housed inside of our pancreatic islet. Here again, we see it is surrounded by those pancreatic acini, or alveoli, again, both of those terms are acceptable. They're the ones producing the pancreatic juice for the digestive system. And here we have one of those pancreatic islets. This particular histology slide has used several incredibly expensive stains that allow us to actually see and distinguish all four types, the alpha, beta, delta, and gamma cells. However, if you were to look at the pancreas in the classroom, would it look like this? No, it would probably look something a little bit more like that. You can still clearly distinguish the pancreatic islet from the acini that are around it. Ooh, what's that? It's a nerve. It's a nerve. You can see all the axons in there. But is it as easy to distinguish the individual cells on something like this? Anybody able to tell the alpha cells just by looking at this? Especially since I haven't told you what an alpha cell looks like? No, of course not. Nor will I. You are not going to be histologically responsible for distinguishing alpha from beta from delta or gamma cells, so I will not ask it that way. I can certainly ask you what hormones are produced here and questions about that, or I could even be more specific. I could ask you what the alpha cells here produce and then what it targets and what its effect and how it's regulated and things along that way. But I will not hold you responsible for individual cells. Is it possible to distinguish them? Yes. Does the histology on the chart distinguish them? Yes. But I will not hold you responsible for that histologically. So I will specifically say alpha or beta cells if I want something precise for that. But clearly you should know that's a pancreatic islet and what goes on in there, and that those are the pancreatic acini, these are the exocrine structures, and this is the endocrine structure. All right? Questions on that?
The endocrine that produces the alpha and the beta, right?
Yes,
So it's the
yeah.
endocrine responsible
Here,
for the glucagon.
here inside of here is where we're producing the hormones insulin and glucagon and a couple other hormones.
Okay.
But yes, here in the islet. All right. Any other questions on the pancreas? All right, here we get to the fun one. I don't want to do this. As we have talked about,